This is John Taylor Gatto, who recently died, but I think he won awards for his teaching in the New York City schools, and he's written a number of books. Weapons of Mass Instruction is another one. This one is Dumbing Us Down, the Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling, both highly recommended. But here's just a little section from the preface of Dumbing Us Down. He's talking about the 30 years. He says, over the past 30 years, I've used my classes as a laboratory where I could learn a broader range of what human possibility is, the whole catalog of hopes and fears, and also as a place where I could study what releases and what inhibits human power. During that time, John Taylor Gatto, have come to believe that genius is an exceedingly common human quality, probably natural to most of us. He says he didn't want to accept that notion. He went to 2 elite universities that taught him quite the opposite. But he says, the trouble was that the unlikeliest kids kept demonstrating to me at random moments so many of the hallmarks of human excellence: insight, wisdom, justice, resourcefulness, courage, originality, that I became confused. And then he says, was it possible I had been hired not to enlarge children's power, but to diminish it? That seemed crazy on the face of it, but slowly I began to realize that the bells and the confinement, the crazy sequences, the age segregation, the lack of privacy, the constant surveillance, and all the rest of the national curriculum of schooling were designed exactly as if someone had set out to prevent children from learning how to think and act, to coax them into addiction and dependent behavior. Bit by bit, I began to devise guerrilla exercises to allow as many of the kids I taught as possible the raw material people have always used to educate themselves: privacy, choice, freedom from surveillance, and as broad a range of situations and human associations as my limited power and resources could manage. So some of the incoherence and the fracturing and the just constant barragement of untrue things masquerading as true things in not just school, but the media today, especially in the last year and a half, but also maybe especially in the last 5 years and 10 years, and it goes on and on, follows from the lack of privacy, the constant surveillance, the segregation by what developmental stage you're at, that we are inculcating in our schools.
Yeah, and I think the tricky part, and I don't always know with Gatto. I mean, I think he nails the phenomenon perfectly, right? He diagnoses exactly the catastrophe that school is, and then I figured out it was because because it gave me the freedom to do so by cutting me loose. The question is, why is it like that, right? And I think the problem is that there are a lot of pieces to that puzzle. There definitely is an influence of employers that want compliant employees. They don't want them too clever because employees that are too clever are a problem. But it's not as if
he walks through sort of the deep history of compulsory schooling coming out of Germany and then the U.S. at the turn of the last century with the era of the robber barons and such. And Taylorism.
But what I'm saying is, there are components of this. There are also ways that those components actually work, right? It's, what are the confusions of a person who finds themselves at the head of a corporation and doesn't necessarily know what they want is employees that have been cognitively hobbled so they're not too independent minded, right? That person doesn't sound like that inside their own mind, right? They have a list of things that they want that are desirable things, and they don't either understand or allow themselves to understand the tensions between those things and other desirable things that they might want, right? So, we see, for example.
So, in part, you're pointing out that there are cognitive dissonances that are required, that because most people aren't supervillains or superheroes, right? It's easy to imagine the nasty CEO who sounds like that, but that's not actually what most of them sound like. And making stark the cognitive dissonances in our own heads is part of what being an educated person is, I think.
Right. It is the ability to decamp and take up a position that you don't hold and see how robust it is if you, give it a good solid go.
Yeah.
And there are also ways of compartmentalizing, right? So some great corporations have had a skunk works in which the rules look very different than they do, right? In other words, even the entity that wants compliant employees to do the job also knows that it has to have unruly people somewhere in order to innovate the next job, right? And so I don't know why school looks the way that it does. I know it's built to fail, where it's built to fail if what you think its purpose is to create enhanced capacity minds. And I completely agree with Gatto. I mean, it's almost a tautology from my perspective that we are all born with genius level capacity, and it gets quickly narrow. All of us who are born intact, right? That the human mind, it's not like some of us are programmed to be super capable and others are programmed not to be. Back to what we talked about last week, we're talking about the blankest slate, in all of Animalia. Why is it the blankest slate? Because that offers the possibility of innovating new programs that are capable of extracting more from the world than a pre-programmed creature could.
So there seems to be an assumption among the chattering class, the so-called intelligentsia, that most people can't handle the truth, right? Basically, and that therefore it needs to be dumbed down. It needs to be obscured in order to deliver the message to get people to do what we've all agreed behind the scenes we need to do. And I think your and my experience in 14, 15 years of classrooms, plus the many years that we spent being teaching assistants in graduate school, revealed quite the opposite. Actually, that, almost everyone is capable of taking in diverse, weird, crappy data that has conflicting signal in it and that requires nuance to parse and trying to make sense of it. And that does not guarantee that everyone will come to the same conclusion, of course, but then neither does democracy. And it's a weird moment to be in when the people in the world's democracies are simultaneously arguing that we need to obscure information from people in order to mandate compliance with conclusions.
Yeah, it's like the generic built-in cover story for which there is no evidence. Right. Yeah. Actually, yes, if you shout fire, people may stampede toward the door. But does that mean, at the point you start obscuring that there's a fire, you're the villain, right? The question is, can we deal with the question of how to get the truth into the public sphere? And, some people will be hearing this and, clutching their pearls over, did they miss the game theory problem? If we tell them the truth, they won't do the right thing. Those things are real.
Yep.
On the other hand, we have a tremendous amount of evidence that not only are humans capable of addressing those things, but that they do it beautifully up until modernity, right? It's modernity that undoes this.
Well, so, is it modernity? And, it being modernity is, and hypernovelty, to use our term, is really one of the prime theses of our book. But as part of modernity, is it also possibly a problem of scale, such that those things that have worked in the past. So it's not so. The thesis in the book is largely it's not. We are best suited to change. The human niche is niche switching, and we deal with change so well and so fast. But the rate of change has become something that even we cannot keep up with. So that is that's one of the main theses of the book. But can we do so even if the rate of change were to slow a little bit with these numbers? Well, with the numbers that we have.
Unfortunately, there's obviously a question, right? There's obviously, I don't know that Dunbar's number is actually a number, but there is a limit above which you can't keep track of the details of some number of individuals' lives, and that creates problems. So there are scale-dependent issues, to be sure. The point is we also have systems in which we can say, look, this is a problem we can't deal with above this scale. That's why we need a system that does the job, right? And these things evolve naturally, right? Catholicism doesn't make any sense if you try to understand it at the level of kin selection, which is part of why evolutionary biologists don't deal well with questions of large religious beliefs and structures. Yep. The point is, evolution was dealing with this problem. Now we have new problems that are modular systems that do work well at unprecedented scales create, right? So for example, if you are a fisherman and your being a fisherman is something that you picked up from your parent and you will pass to your children. It's the family job. Your interest in the fishery being healthy is built in. You intuit it. And as the fishery begins to fail, it causes you to worry, as it should. Whereas if you are part of a corporation that is extracting fish from the sea, but it is also extracting lumber from the land, and it is, doing 17 other things. And what's more, the members of the board of the corporation are also members of the boards of other corporations. And so the point is, well, this is all like, skin cells that can be sloughed. And as long as we have some new thing to do, it doesn't matter that we destroyed our last opportunity. And if we didn't, somebody else would have. So we might as well. The point is, you've just created a tragedy of the commons where individuals who had a coherent way of being that continued from one generation to the next would have avoided it, right? For
it's
reasons.
A tragedy of the aggregate commons.
It's a tragedy of the new mechanism by which the commons will supposedly be managed, but it couldn't possibly be, right? So it's like you will hear people challenge the idea of the tragedy of the commons based on the fact that Eleanor Ostrom proved it wasn't true, but they don't really understand that both things are true. The tragedy of the commons is real. Eleanor Ostrom's discovery of the mechanisms whereby people avoid tragedies of the commons are real. And then this novel thing.
The tragedy of the commons isn't your inherent fate, but it could be.
It is simultaneously inescapable and easily solved. And that's the problem, right? It's inescapable if you structure things a certain way, and it's easily solved if you structure them a different way. And the question is, well, which have you done? Are you magically hoping that it's going to solve itself, because it won't? Or do you have a coherent structure that exists because it succeeded in preventing tragedies of the commons from unfolding? So anyway, none of this is all that hard, right? You just have to know what to focus on, and you can't have.
Oh no, it's a bit hard, and it requires keeping a number of things in your head at the same time. And I do think that again, it's become all too easy for me, and frankly, it became very easy for me in grad school, and just got worse for the many years that we were professors, to point my finger squarely at the people who are supposedly our peers and say, this is actually on you. Like, this is not on the many people who you claim to be caring about and educating, because I hear what you sound like when you leave the room and how you talk about the students and how you talk about the people who don't go to college. And, frankly, it's unacceptable. And your degrees often don't mean anything, because I've also seen what those programs look like where you got the degrees, and they're often worthless, and they're not teaching you how to think, and they're not teaching you how to hold, things in your head that seem like they couldn't possibly be true, and sit with that for long enough. Go like, okay, instead of just getting so uncomfortable so quickly that you kind of just make a hasty decision and throw one away, and it's possible that one you threw away was the true one, and that this was the one in error, or that it's actually different contexts, and you need to know that these are both possible, but in different contexts. There is a refusal to sit with uncertainty that is, I think, all too often a result of a modern education. And the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be really uncomfortable with that uncertainty.
I think it's even worse, because not only are these programs very often
the academic programs, degree programs, something
like worthless, but that they are actually successful at doing something that is antithetical to their stated purpose, right? So what they effectively do is take highly capable people and cause them to become responsible to certain kinds of dog whistles that snap them in line. And, at first, it's an issue where you may be able to think across a domain very effectively, and then something can't quite stomach the last step in that domain. And so it backs you off just slightly. But eventually, once you've allowed something to stand between an individual and the pursuit of the complete truth as best we can understand it, right. What the point is, you just basically breached the dam. Right. Yeah. Once you have that ability to, hold back on the truth a little bit, the point is it just becomes captured, and it sells false stories that are actually about economic well-being or political power. And the problem is, you've got all of these people with fancy degrees who, yes, if they had been raised in a different system, might be very, very good in their domain, but in fact are capable of telling flat out lies because something successfully signals to them, hey, you go too far down that road and you're going to starve, right? There are there are not enough jobs and you won't have one if you keep going that direction.
Right. And this is a conversation for another time probably, but this is what tenure is supposed to grant, right? Like tenure is supposed to provide the protection against such perverse incentives that now you can tell all the truth, right? But certainly for scientists, it can't possibly be fully protective because, as we've talked about in previous episodes, at the moment, the way that science is funded means that your tenure doesn't get you anything. Like the tenure doesn't get you NIH grants or NSF grants. You need to be asking the right kinds of questions and have peers that are going to read your grant application with a kind eye, and then peer reviewers for the publication of it. And so it has become, as such systems will, it has become a series of sort of nested sets of cronies. And somehow when you say that, you get told that you're not speaking truth, even though it's exactly the truth.
Well, we've got another problem with respect to tenure, which is that the things that you are absolutely required to be good at in order to get it are the things that guarantee that once you have it, you're not going to use it for anything interesting, right? And
said the guy who had tenure to another person who had tenure
at Evergreen.
At Evergreen, yeah.
It wasn't even called tenure. So the point is, Evergreen was so weird, and the whole process was so bizarre that yes, we did have the thing that was closest to tenure at Evergreen. Look how much good it did us, but but nonetheless, it is exactly the same puzzle as well. How do you get to be president? Right. Well, you have to demonstrate that you are, good at greasing the wheels and taking orders from the people who've got the power. And then once you have that job, the point is what you're excellent at is corruption, right? Which is exactly why, frankly, Unity 2020 was, whatever you may think of the plan itself, the right idea, which is you have to speed somebody past the corruption and get them into the office that has the power in order that when they get into that office, they will do something that isn't corrupt, right? Yeah.
How about this? Here's a quote from the great Robert Pirsig in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, an Inquiry into Values, which is a book I highly recommend. The real purpose of the scientific method is to make sure nature hasn't misled you into thinking you know something you actually don't know. If you get careless or go romanticizing scientific information, giving it a flourish here and there, nature will soon make a complete fool out of you. So this in service not of talking about all of school. I don't know that has particular relevance in a discussion of literature or art, perhaps. But when Zen was written in 1974, I think I don't have it written down. Something 70s, I believe. And here he says, if you get careless or go romanticizing scientific information, giving it a flourish here or there, that sounds like #follow the science.
Yeah,
to me, right? This is
exactly
he's seeing it a long time ago, and there are others. There are certainly other important scientific papers from that era and the 60s as well, saying, wait a minute, I see some fields beginning to go off the rails and being less analytical, less creative, more canalized, and even that discussion is becoming harder and harder to have now.
Well, the problem is what we were talking about earlier, where there's a sort of sense that certain things are true in a way that we can actually skip the methodological part. And because they're true and it's really important that people get them, then, the point is it's time for, honorable PR on behalf of these true things. And I 100% agree. And, we have said many times different versions of the single value of the scientific method is that it tells you where what you think is correct isn't, right? The whole point of the thing is to force you into the place where you can see what is true in spite of what you expected. If it was all intuitive and we could all just say, well, we know X, Y, and Z, you wouldn't need this method. And so what we are now living in is an era in which people think that the landscape of those things that you can just intuit, this thing is good and that thing is bad, and here's the solution to our problem, right? And the point is, well, that stuff, it's not like we've got to, everybody here went to college. We don't need to run through all of those things to figure out whether they're right. Let's just get the message to the masses. And the answer is, do you understand what especially in complex systems, right? If you're talking about these supposedly obvious truths about what we should be doing and shouldn't be doing in a complex system, or, even worse, as the case is with COVID, where you have a 3-layered complex system, right? No, you need to think very carefully about whether or not something in that set of layers reverses one of the signs on something and makes the conclusion something completely counterintuitive.
It's not clear to me what the 3 layers are you're talking about.
You've got the immune system, a complex system in and of itself, embedded in a creature, a complex system embedded in a society with a pandemic, right? That's 3 complex systems layered on top of each other. And the idea of, well, we all know what the solutions to these things are, and let's deploy it as quick as possible. It's like, you do not know what game you are playing. You do not know how intricate the interrelationships are in each of those layers, and then how little we know about the relationships between the layers. And so anyway, we get sold a bill of goods, but the basic point is, look, if you want science done right, you have to insulate it completely from those forces that think they know the truth and are just trying to get it out there, right? Yeah. Because what that ends up being is just an invitation to market forces. It's an invitation to corruption, to the co-opting of the scientific voice, right? And that's really what it is. It's a voice, an authoritative voice that isn't about science, that is being used to get people to think in a particular way. For what reason, maybe we don't even know yet, but it's a very dangerous process. And the point is, the only antidote is real science, and real science is quirky and weird and done by people with, who may not be the easiest to get along with. They may not be your favorite person at the cocktail party, but you need people who are good at the method and know how to deploy it and know that they can't back down just because it tells them something counterintuitive. Yeah.
And it often doesn't look like you're expecting. It's not linear, and it doesn't necessarily come in a lab coat with glassware.
Right. Yeah. Right. The trappings of science are not science. Science is a method, right? And then, as we've demonstrated before, science can be done in a laboratory. It can also be done wearing rubber boots and, wielding a machete, right? That's right. Science is a method that works anywhere where there are processes to be understood.